Thanks very much, Peg, and thank you for having me here tonight. I'm going to read an excerpt from my new in-progress novel called Red Wagon. And all you need to know is it takes place in Gilgal, Utah. Leah Farmer is the mother of 9 daughters. And just before we pick up, there has been a flash flood in this small town. Glasses off. A miracle is what Sister Snow, the Relief Society president, said. A miracle. The words whispered solemnly throughout Gilgal. A miracle. The windows broken in the chapel, the carpet ruined, the pews sodden and warped. A few houses picked up and carried down the valley. A broken arm, a concussion, a chill. But this inhuman thing bore down on Gilgal with apocalyptic fury, and only 5 were dead. All 5 working in the mine at the bottom of the sharp valley, the town battered, but not crippled. The word miracle traveled from mouth to ear, almost shamefully, almost thrilling with self-righteousness. The lesson was clear. The 5 who died, the last few miners shutting down operations before the tapped-out mine was closed for good, were working on the Sabbath. The rest of Gilgal was safe in church, or on their way to church. The Relief Society were unfolding metal chairs and placing them in rows. A week after the flood, and the chapel was unusable, so church was to be held in the cafeteria of the elementary school. Leah handed chairs to Sister Snow, watching the women move in their flowered dresses, nylon shushing against each other, chatting about mildewed carpet, flooded basements, ruined books. Sister Goetz looked up from where she was laying a white cloth over a cafeteria table, finding Leah's eyes. She smiled. Sister Goetz's house was gone, lifted from its foundation by the flood and smashed at the bottom of the valley. She had been sleeping for the last week in Brenda and Alita's old room. She wore one of Alita's dresses, the shoulders hanging loose over her own skinny frame. Nothing measures up, thought Leah. How many times, thought Leah, have I felt, this is it, this is real, this is history, only to be disappointed. Since the day she turned on the television to see an airplane fly into a building and pieces of plane, building, human beings come out the other side. This is it, she thought. Greatness would be required of them, and sacrifice, like when her mother had stood on street corners with her sisters singing in sweet harmony. Any bonds today? The 3 sisters wearing skirts their mother had made from her own wedding dress. They'd gone without butter and sugar and had to special order Jell-O for her mother's nosebleeds. We're ready, Leah had thought then. It's in our blood. Our people crossed the continent, driven from one place to another, until they found a home where no one else wanted one. Whole families died. Babies were born to women as they stepped to the side of the path, blood splashing in the dirt. You could see it in their faces in the old photographs, the lines in their faces showing the day their babies died, mouths loose around their nipples. Women who shared a husband with 7 other women. When they cried in the night, it was their sister wives who comforted them. The husband had other things to do. It was the women you could see who were strong. But after the shock of the planes and the people falling and jumping, when maybe all of us were ready, the family gathered around the television to hear what was asked of them, ready to tear down mountains and go barefoot and give up sugar. And their leader stood and said, "Go shopping." And Leah felt disappointed, her moment of greatness slipping away. Her daughter Florine laughed, her red ponytail flipping over one shoulder as she turned back toward her mother and said, "With what money?" And Leah saw that nothing much would change. She couldn't help it. When she saw the wall of water thundering into the valley, Leah thought, "I'm ready." School was excused and the factory where Stanley worked shut down, and the whole town pulled together to clean up after the flood. The farmers took in Sister Goetz, and the Relief Society made sandwiches for the men who were already pouring the foundation for her new house. But But now, watching the women in their Sunday hairdos, Leah wondered again, like Peggy Lee, is that all there is? Is that all there is to a flood? The ward members began to gather, talking, some wearing borrowed or damaged Sunday clothes, squeaking the metal chairs across the floor as they sat. Stanley and the girls filled in the seats beside Leah, the girls whispering back and forth, laughter dissolving in shushes as the second counselor to the bishop stood to give the opening prayer. There was no piano in the cafeteria, so this week they sang a cappella, the chorister humming the pitch as she raised her hands to lead them in the opening song. Come, come, ye saints, no toil or labor fear, but with joy wend your way. People shifted, coughing, the coughs echoing to the roof of the cafeteria, bouncing off the metal shutters over the serving windows, the tables folded and stacked at one end of the room. All is well, all is well. The song was written and sung by those early members of the church as they walked their long road. Why should we mourn or think our lot is hard, they asked, and their descendants answered in voices thrilling at their own strength, righteousness, and adversity. All is well, all is well. Gilgallians felt themselves singing as one, the spirits of their pioneer ancestors living in them. They shook the rafters with their song, Leah with the rest of them. There was a pause before the last verse. All sound stopped, the chorister's hands up, shaking visibly. She nodded, and drawing a small semicircle in the air, brought all voices softly to life. And should we die before our journey's through, happy day, all is well. The bishop stood and cleared his throat, the sound ringing through the mic. Brothers and sisters, it is with a heavy heart that I stand before you today in the midst of tragedy. This flood is a trial that has tested every one of us. Has it? Leah thought, then looked down at her hands, ashamed. There were families who had lost. 5 dead is 5 too many. Stanley reached out and placed a hand over hers. He blinked quickly, thick eyelids batting back tears. What is wrong with me, wondered Leah. We have all suffered deep, tragic losses. Brother Smithson will be missed by us all. The bishop paused, letting the ward members remember Brother Smithson, letting them begin to think of Brother Smithson drowning in the mine, holding his breath maybe as long as he could before giving up, giving in, opening his mouth and letting the water slice into his lungs and pull him deeper and deeper. And yet, and here the bishop squared himself to the mic, one hand holding the papers he jotted his talk on, free hand reaching vaguely toward the mic stand, missing a podium to rest on. And yet, brothers and sisters, we have witnessed a miracle. Nothing can replace our lost brothers, our homes that were destroyed. Yet how much worse it could have been. How much worse. And how our community has pulled together, going the extra mile to help those most in need. It was a beautiful thing to watch our sisters rushing to help before the waters had even receded. Sister Monson opening the doors of her home to the displaced. Sister Heath. Here the bishop stopped. He twitched his head and raised a hand as if to make a point, but the hand never reached its destination, hanging there in front of him while the bishop looked a little to the left, as though the word he was looking for was right there, just inside his skull, if only he could see it. A bead of saliva grew on the bishop's bottom lip, fattened, pulled itself together, and hung, glistening. His mouth gaped open like a change purse. The ward members shifted in their seats, feet moving across the floor, that sound, that almost sound when a body of people who were breathing, singing, crying, all as one, that sound when they become aware of themselves again, come back into individual consciousness. Leah leaned toward her husband, her eyes on the bishop, whispering, "Is he all right?" Stanley shrugged by a millimeter, looking with his wife toward the man who still stood frozen, the drop of saliva pulling free, drawing out a long, shining line before finally dropping soundlessly to the floor. The second counselor, sitting behind the bishop, was the first to come by degrees to his feet, hesitating, leaning forward as he did so, trying to see the bishop's face, make sure he was okay, reaching at a hand, and just before he touched him, The bishop switched on again, his hand making the end of its arc, knocking against the mic, and as he reached to study it, his face still abstracted, still working on some distant problem, rustling the papers in his other hand, he said something, quietly, half into the mic, and people in the back rows leaned forward to catch the words. "What did he say?" Leah heard Florine whisper loudly. Esther frowned at her sister. "Red wagon," she whispered back. And the words were making their way through the cafeteria chapel. "Red wagon," whispered from person to person. Then the bishop blinked twice and wrapped his hand around the mic, pointing his eyebrows at the papers in his hand. Sister Aikman, who brought food to the men working to clear the mine pumps. The second counselor had been hovering, bent over, his bottom hanging above his chair, and now he eased himself back down into a sitting position, the bishop reading smoothly. The crisis